Let's understand specificity in CSS. And in order to do so, we'll first create a div, and we'll give our div a class of container class, and we'll give it an ID of container ID. So we have a container class and container ID now. So let me use container class to give our div a width of 100 pixels, a height of 100 pixels, and a background color of yellow. And once we save our document, we have our styles applied to our div container. So what if I would use our ID to style the exact same element? So let me do that. Let me use hashtag container minus ID. And let's say I want to have a background color of aqua, for example. But now our div has the background color of aqua. So the container ID is basically overwritten the container class. So that means if you have a class and an ID, the ID seems to be more important than the class, and it does not just seem to be a matter of the order, because if I put our container class right after the container ID, the container ID would still override the container class. So it seems like targeting an element by ID seems to be stronger than targeting an element by class. And that is something that you just have to remember. An ID is always stronger than a class. But there's more to it. What if I would just use the div element, for example, and say I want to have a background color of bisque, for example. And as you can see, I'm saving the file and nothing seems to happen. So a normal element seems to be weaker than an ID, for example. So let me delete the ID and see what is going to happen. Once I delete the ID, you can see we now have our yellow class. So a class seems to be stronger than a regular element as well. So an element seems to be weaker than a class when it comes to specificity, and it seems to be weaker than an ID. So let me take the width and the height to the div so that we can see it. And once I delete the container class property, or the selector basically, and save the document, now we can see bisque right here. So now our element selector seems to work. So an element selector works when you only target that element by using an element selector. If you have a class selector, the class selector has priority over the element selector. And if you have an ID selector, for example, like so, the ID selector has priority over class selector and over the element selector. And now there's one thing that has even more priority than the ID selector, and that is inline styles. And you can obviously define an inline style by using style. And let's say we want to have a background color of, for example, let's take blue violet. And once we save, our container now has the color blue violet. So inline styles even override ID selectors. But usually you don't really want to use inline styles, so that is something that is not really that important because you want to avoid them anyways. In addition to that, you could also use the important keyword right here and say, okay, that one is really important, please override every other selector, and important has the highest priority. So if you use important, this will basically override anything. But again, I want to mention that this lesson, to a lot of people, this one is like really important, but to me, I think it's kind of useless. You never want to use important anyways. You should write your code in a way that does not even force you to use important in the first place. In the second place, I feel like you should only target your files in CSS by using a single class or ID. You should not use class and IDs separately to target the same element. So even that doesn't really matter. And I would not really suggest to use element selectors at all anyway. So if you have an ID and you want to target a specific element, use the ID. If you want to target multiple elements, use the classes of these elements. Element has a lower specificity, then you have class, ID, inline styles, and important overrides everything. And that's all you need to know about specificity in CSS.